As Arkansas's population grows, so do our energy demands. But with the right mix of resources, reliable, affordable power will always be a reality. These resources are all around us in our rivers, blowing through our trees, even right below our feet. The answer isn't focusing on one resource, it's embracing them all. The electric cooperatives of Arkansas know that a balanced approach to power builds our communities and powers our dreams. Visit themixmatters.com and see why there's power in knowledge.
Well, first of all, Asa Hutchinson, thank you for sitting down with us. Let's begin with, you got a primary opponent, Curtis Coleman, your only challenger in the Republican Party primary. Do you feel like there's a danger that if you don't overperform in the primary, that there's going to be this tag that there's an enthusiasm gap for the Republican nominee? And I'm assuming that you're going to win because I think you're the front runner at this time.
Well, one, we're not taking the Republican primary for granted. We're campaigning very hard with our county organizations, even with the Tea Party is an important element of the vote in the Republican primary. So we're going to all of these venues, competing hard, not taking it for granted. You know, in terms of expectations, I just want to win the primary, and I think that's all people look at. Whenever, my opponent's been out there for probably 2 years before I ever got out there. He's been campaigning, and so a well-known figure in Republican circles. And so we're taking it very seriously, and we're just going to campaign extraordinarily hard.
50% plus one is going to be okay with you.
That's what I consider a victory, and will give us momentum going into November.
Curtis Coleman doesn't think you're conservative enough, obviously, or he would not be challenging you, and those are some of the comments that he's made, that he feels like he's more conservative than you. He wants larger tax cuts than what you've advocated for. Where else do you see differences between you and Curtis Coleman in this primary in terms of your conservatism?
Well, I think we're both conservative. We're both traditional Republicans in that sense, but my proof is in my record. I mean, I actually have voted for tax cuts when I was in Congress, first tax cuts in 16 years. I've actually balanced the budget. Whenever I left Congress, it was the last balanced budget we had in our nation. And so, those are pretty good conservative records. Whenever you talk about the Constitution, one of the good things that we did, we had a rule change that required any bill that would be introduced in the legislature to be tied to a basis in the Constitution that gives the federal government authority to legislate in that area. So those are good conservative principles, and I've outlined a tax plan that is conservative. It actually lowers rates, helps us to be more competitive with our surrounding states. So there's a lot of differences, of course, but I think my record speaks for itself in terms of strong conservative.
Let's talk about your tax plan and what you've proposed doing. Basically, and I'm generalizing here, about $100 million in tax cuts that would hit middle income Arkansans would be most favorably affected by that. Do you want to do more? Do you wish you could do more? Do you think that, looking at what's happened in the fiscal session this time around, do you think that there is an opportunity to do more? Or do you think you may have to pare that back?
Well, one, I'm very glad that the legislature has not spent all of the surplus. They saved back over $100 million, which is what we were hoping for as we go into next year. That gives you the working room for tax reform and tax reductions next year. And yes, I want to do more, but you have to have a starting point. If you don't have a realistic place to start, you're never going to get to a good ending. And here we've proposed $100 million in tax cuts that would target middle income folks as the beginning point for reducing the tax rates. And it goes a full percentage point down from 7% to 6% and 6% to 5%, depending upon where you fall there. The important thing to remember is that of all the candidates out there, I'm the only one that's presented a plan that actually lowers rates. Congressman Ross presented a plan that doesn't lower rates. It indexes to inflation going back to 1970. And so it keeps all of the same complicated structure in place versus reducing the rates, which gives us the competitive advantage that we need with our other states.
Do you think that we could eventually eliminate the individual income tax in Arkansas? It is almost 50% of state revenues. I mean, that's some dangerous territory to do major reforms there in terms of still being able to provide for state services.
No, it would be very doubtful, if not impossible, without raising other taxes, that I don't want to raise the sales tax. I certainly don't want to raise property taxes, which is not an income stream for the state anyway. And so this is just reform and reduction that you can do based upon the normal growth, and hopefully faster paced growth that we can have by giving tax cuts to the middle class. And so it's a reasonable place to start. As to how far you can take that, I think it depends upon how we can grow our economy here in this state. But if we can get it down to 5%, all of a sudden we're competitive with Texas and Tennessee that have zero.
Yeah, even though those states don't have any income tax, how are we competitive with them in that
Well,
respect?
because I talk to people in West Memphis and they lose employees to Tennessee. But if we have a 5% rate, which they're very excited about, all of a sudden our lower property taxes and our quality of life is appealable to them. So they were convinced we can compete if we can just get it down to 5%. Now maybe we can do more, but that would not be reasonable to start off talking about more reductions than that. As the Governor Beebe said, my plan was prudent. I think it's a reasonable place to start, and hopefully we can do more down the road.
And you think too that you have to look at tax reform in the total tax structure in the state of Arkansas too. I mean, what people pay in property taxes, sales taxes, and what corporations pay in taxes. Some of those other states have higher property taxes, and so it's a little bit difficult to make that argument for the average voter to really understand, don't you think?
Well, we have to remember that every state does have a different tax structure and circumstances. Like Texas has a tremendous amount of energy taxes, and Louisiana has the same. And so, you're comparing a little bit of apples and oranges. So you take what you've got and what you have to deal with in your state, and even though we might not be able to eliminate the income tax, surely we can reduce it so we can be competitive. The whole object is one, fairness, but it is also job creation. And for us to attract industry, for us not to lose entrepreneurs, we have to have a more competitive tax rate.
I want to take you down the road of two controversial issues that have surfaced in this campaign. Let's start first with this past week. The Arkansas Education Association endorsed Mike Ross in the governor's race. One of your spokesmen said that in this case, he's joined with the National Teachers Union, who put their liberal ideas ahead of our kids. Do you stand by that statement? Because you got some criticism from the Ross campaign for not disavowing that statement.
Well, of course, we're not disavowing the statement. Whenever you look at the NEA, the National Teachers Organization, the National Union, they have supported Obamacare. They've been advocates of the Democrat majority in Congress, including Mike Ross. They've been team players, so of course we're not surprised that the union would endorse Mike Ross. Now, Mike Ross tries to equate the union with all the teachers in Arkansas, and of course that's wrong. We have tremendous support among the teachers, and my sister was a public school teacher. My kids graduated from the public schools, so I'm an advocate for teachers. They're going to be the solution to education problems in Arkansas. The unions is somebody that we know is on the Democrat side. Is going to be endorsing Mike Ross, and he has had union support all the time that he's been in Congress.
You interviewed with the AEA though, didn't you?
Well, I met with them, and that's just like the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO is going to endorse Mike Ross. They haven't announced that yet, but they're going to. But if they invite me to meet with them, then I'm happy to do so. And it's the same thing with the AEA. I believe in meeting with political adversaries because you learn from them. They're part of the political operations in Arkansas. So absolutely I'll meet with them. Just didn't expect their endorsement. Didn't seek it.
Let's talk about the private option, the biggest really public policy issue here in the state of Arkansas. You've been a little hard to pin down from some of us in the media as to where you stand on the private option. Now that the funding is passed into fiscal year 2015, you would be dealing with this issue as governor if you're elected. Can you take a more definitive position on the private option at this time? Do you support it, yes or no?
Well, one, I think I made the absolute right call that the legislature was dealing with pins and needles as to how to resolve this conflict. The last thing they needed was Mike Ross or myself popping off on it. I think they made the decision. And my every position I take is in relation to what I'm going to do in 2015. Now the dust is settled. We know that they have funded the private option. We know that there's not any short-term budgetary impacts on it. And so in 2015, just like Kim Hammer said, who changed his vote from a no to a yes, he said, now we're going to see if it works. And so I view this as a pilot project. In fact, it'll be a smaller pilot project with the limitations on the marketing aspect of it. And a pilot project is right because we're going to see what's the long-term cost. We're going to be able to get an idea on the insurance premiums and whether they fix with their predictions. We're going to see the benefit to the rural hospitals. And so at that time, then we'll be able to make a decision, is this the right path for the future? And so those are all the criteria that I will evaluate in 2015. Long-term cost, benefits that we're getting, and also I would say that you can expect from me continued efforts at reform. The private option was a start. The whole design is reform. You can expect more reform of the private option and our health care policy in Arkansas to make it unique to this state, make it work for this state. And a key criteria for me is I want incentives for people to work and not incentives for people not to work. And I want to make sure that all of the benefits of this state are that enticing for people to say, hey, I'm going to be better off by working.
Tell me a little bit about some potential reform ideas that you may have in your mind for the private option. I've talked to a number of legislators who talk about health savings accounts being more instituted, co-pays. I have talked to some legislators who don't like the amendments that were put on to restrict the navigators and the promotion of the program. What do you have in mind for potential changes, potential reforms?
Well, in terms of the health savings accounts, that's another thing we're waiting on for the federal government to grant the waiver to see if that can be implemented in Arkansas, which is a key waiver. And I'm actually hopeful because I believe in health savings accounts. I actually have one myself. I'm a little skeptical as to whether those that qualify for the private option will move that direction because it takes some money and some effort to do that.
But, and is it complicated as well, or is it?
It's not that complicated, but it takes some guidance and to get it done. But also it takes cash. I mean, you're looking at private option for those that are on marginal incomes or are not high income individuals, and so their cash flow is strained. You have to have a cash flow capability to really put a health savings account into place. So let's look at that. Let's see if it works, if they grant the waiver. Obviously that's a good reform to look at. In terms of additional reforms, let's wait and see. I actually want to meet with our Health and Human Services here in Arkansas to get I want to see very close hand as to who is on the private option. I want to take a good study of who's on the private option now, who's taking advantage of this, and I want to get a personal flavor as to how it's working. Once I do that, then we'll see what additional reforms will be meaningful down the road.
But for now, you're supportive of the private option as the policy of the state of Arkansas because it is the law of the land and it has been funded.
Oh, sure. You know, it's the law, and our legislature by 2/3 or 3/4 vote approved it, and so the debate has ended for now. But the debate will continue, and so I support the pilot project that you see in place now, and we want to see how it works. And I will evaluate it just like all the other legislators will in terms of what's the long-term cost impact and what's the benefit we're getting from this state, and does it promote work and encouragement to work in our society.
Last question for you. Right now, Republicans have a strong majority in the Arkansas State Senate, a tenuous majority in the Arkansas House of Representatives, and I think that's really where a legislative battle will be in the key races this fall. How would you govern differently if there is a Democratic majority in the House versus a Republican majority in the House and the legislature as a whole? Will that change your strategy on things?
You know, it doesn't change your strategy because each one represents a vote that you've got to get on key parts of legislation. Now, I think a Republican majority would be more inclined toward tax cuts, would be more inclined toward reform of our health care system, would be more inclined to support some of my initiatives. But that's, but each one represents a vote, and regardless, we're probably not going to have 3/4 majority, and so you have to reach out to the Democrats, and that's important. I think that's a good characteristic of our government, that you have to have both sides working together where it really has a bipartisan solution. That's what's unique about Arkansas, and we'll certainly continue that path.